When 2014's Guardians of the Galaxy hit cinema screens, it did so without the weight of expectation placed upon its back. It was a movie based on some relatively obscure Marvel characters, and the common preconception during the time of its release was that it was going to be Marvel's first real flop for quite some time. To most people's surprise, Guardians was a huge hit, both critically and financially, and upon viewing it myself it quickly became one of my favourite chapters in Marvel Cinematic Universe. Fast forward 3 years and not only are the likes of Rocket, Star-Lord and Gamora much better known to the general public, the expectations thrust upon the sequel are huge in comparison to the original. Due to how good the first instalment is, Volume 2 has a hell of a lot to live up to, and whilst it is another fun and humour-filled trip, it just doesn't quite possess the same magic as its predecessor. That being said, however, Volume 2 starts off with a phenomenal opening sequence, in which Drax, Gamora, Star-Lord and Rocket are all fighting a giant intergalactic space beast, whilst Baby Groot takes centre stage and boogies to some of Peter Quill's old tunes. The camera focuses almost entirely on Groot, with the other heroes occasionally coming into focus as they are flung by the beast towards him. All the while Groot is perfectly happy in his own little world, oblivious to what is going on behind him. If this opening doesn't make you crack a smile, then I don't know what will. Based on the opening alone, it would be fair to assume that Groot would be the star of the show, especially when you consider how much his image has been used in the marketing of the film. Well, although Groot does have some brilliant scenes, luckily he isn't overused, and Guardians Volume 2 does a fantastic job of managing such a large cast of heroes. Of course, some are still handled better than others. For example, despite Nebula getting more minutes on screen this time around, she still ends up being the weakest and least interesting character of the bunch. And although there are a great number of jokes at Mantis' expense, she isn't really that great an addition to the crew. I feel the standout performance goes to Michael Rooker as the badass Yondu. Yondu was one of my favourite parts of the first film, and he fully deserves the extra screen time afforded to him in the sequel. His relationship with Star-Lord is greatly expanded upon, and James Gunn manages to give the audience an excellent explanation as to why Yondu originally kidnapped Peter when he was just a kid on Earth. All in all, Volume 2 manages to connect to the first movie in a very natural and believable way, which makes sense considering this instalment takes place only a couple of months after the end of the first film. In terms of the narrative, Volume 2 mainly centres on Star-Lord reuniting with his long-term absentee father and discovering the truth of his heritage, a mystery that was briefly touched upon in the original. To go into more detail in relation to this would be treading deep into spoiler territory, so I won't say too much. However, what I will say is that I do feel that although the story is perhaps a bit more focused this time around, it does become a bit of a drag, especially during the middle. To put it simply, the film's second act goes on for far too long, and in fact I found myself quite bored at one point. The saving grace is that during this segment, Yondu, Groot and Rocket find themselves separated from the rest of the Guardians. Their scenes together are far more interesting and entertaining than those featuring Star-Lord, and without them the film would struggle even more so than it does to get to its final act. One thing that the film doesn't struggle with is its attempts at humour. Admittedly, there are some jokes that don't quite hit the mark. For example, early on there's a particular joke about a piece of fruit not being ripe that is repeated 3 times by several characters, which quite frankly just isn't very funny at all. However, for the most part the majority of the gags included did make me chuckle. Drax delivers some of the funniest lines and his laugh is absolutely infectious. So much so that it made me laugh even at times when he didn't actually say anything particularly witty. Yondu also has a brilliant line towards the end of the movie, which references another famous Disney character, and there's a hilarious scene in which him and Rocket are jumping through hyperspace that resembles something visually out of an episode of Ren and Stimpy. Although I previously mentioned that the film drags a bit during the middle section, thankfully the finale manages to be as entertaining as the brilliant introduction. The climatic battle is well shot and contains some visually striking action sequences, although it is guilty of following the standard Marvel formula of having a giant boss battle at the end of the film. Despite this, it still manages to hit all the right notes in regards to triggering the viewer's emotions, and even features in my opinion a conclusion that is more affecting than the I Am Groot scene that can be found in the first. It's painfully obvious that Guardians Volume 2 is a very good film, although despite this I just didn't feel the same spark as I did when I watched the first. The original movie was something unique, a sci-fi superhero film that came out at a time when there was little else like it. The newly released sequel manages to simultaneously feel like more of the same and a step down from its predecessor, due to its poor pacing and retreading of old ideas. There is however still a hell of a lot to love about this follow-up, and I would definitely recommend fans give it a watch. Guardians Volume 2 is a fun sequel that doesn't quite hit the bar set by the first.